Hello, my name is Erin Villamek. I'll be presenting my project today on classifying weather events using a data mining technique. The outline of this presentation first will be the introduction, then I'll go over some related work on the topic. I'll walk through my proposed work, so I'll walk through the algorithm used, what data source was used, and the pre-processing that it went through. The algorithm development, performance metrics, and implementation on the dataset. I'll go over the results, conclusion and future work, and then a demo of the user dashboard. So weather forecasts impact everyone on the planet. It doesn't really matter where you live. The daily weather is going to affect you somehow. So weather forecasting, therefore, is kind of a significant feat. And there's all kinds of research and different methods to forecast the weather. This project in particular tackles weather forecasting from a data mining perspective. The algorithm used is a C4.5 tree. It was built using R, and the interactive dashboard for the user that shows results was made in Tableau. So there's, as I mentioned, a lot of related work on this topic, especially in the areas of data mining and machine learning. So first off, a study by Olaya and Adeyemo. They predicted wind speeds, temperature, and rainfall using the combination of a decision tree and an artificial neural network. Another study by Mercer predicted tornadic versus non-tornadic weather outbreaks. This was using a combination of weather and research forecast models and statistical classification. Another study by Zaripur classified wind ramp events. So basically that just means like the strength of like wind gusts using a support vector machine. And then moving in more to related work focusing on decision trees. Study by Colquhoun, they used a rule-based approach to thunderstorm severity and tornadoes, and this particular study occurred in the 1980s when data mining was still very young, so their algorithm was actually just a decision tree drawn out on paper. And then later on, there are a couple of studies, one by Kumar, one by Peter, both using cart decision trees, but one was used to predict weather events, and then the other was used to forecast temperatures in Hong Kong. For this project, a C4.5 tree was used. This type of tree is similar to the ID3 tree, but there's some extra functionalities that can be added. So the main difference is that gain ratio is used to grow the tree, which I'll get into in a little bit. But some other things about this tree that it can do is it is able to handle continuous variables and handle missing values as well. The data source used for this project was a daily weather activity in Austin, Texas between the years 2013 and 2017. This data source was taken off of Kaggle's website, and it was a CSV file. Some examples of things that are measured, each row is a day, and there were attributes regarding temperatures, wind levels, humidity, precipitation, dew point, etc. There were a number of attributes, and for most of the attributes, there was a daily high, low, and average measure. So for temperature, there would be an attribute for temperature high, temperature low, and temperature average. So in total, the data source had about 1,300 rows and 21 attributes. The weather events, so that's our predictor attribute, was whether or not a weather event happened that day. And it consisted of combinations of rain, thunderstorms, and fog, or there was no event at all. So as far as preprocessing goes, the first step I took was to replace missing values. This is because in the CSV file that I took off the website, instead of just putting like 0 or a null for missing values, there was a dash inserted, and so it was throwing off how R was reading the data types of the data set. So I replaced the dashes with zeros to take care of that. And then I was able to cast all of the all of the continuous attributes to numeric. And then the second step that I took was to determine if there were any variables that were highly correlated. And so the pairs plot on the right kind of shows this. It's hard to tell because it's so small here. But there were a few variables that were highly correlated. And so my conclusion from that was that in one of the iterations, I can get rid of the redundant variables that are correlated to hopefully improve performance. And then finally, I created a training, validation, and test set out of the data set. It was random samples of 70, 20, and 10%. So the algorithm development, there are two main algorithms that are part of this project. The first one is the training algorithm that grows the tree. The second one is the predicting function, which I'll get to next. So first, the training algorithm. The inputs are the data set and an empty tree object. So the tree object was created using the data.tree package in R. First step of this function is it creates a node containing the entire data set, and then it will try to find the optimal split. As I mentioned before, the metric that it uses to determine optimal split is gain ratio. You have to do a few extra calculations to eventually get to gain ratio. First entropy, then information gain, then split info. Those are all required. So the first step is to calculate entropy for each attribute that you could split on. This measures the proportion of records in your node compared to the total records in the dataset. Once you calculate entropy for each attribute, you can calculate the information gain, which ultimately what that means is it'll measure how evenly the partitions are split for your different attributes. And then finally, the third sub-calculation you have to do is split info, which this measures the proportion of your partition count versus the number of records in each partition. And then finally, gain ratio can be calculated, which is just a ratio of information gain and split info. And gain ratio will show less bias towards high numbers of partitions. Basically what that means is if you have a tree with a subtree with a lot of branches and small numbers of data inside of each branch, it'll show less bias towards that, whereas information gain would be more biased towards that. And considering the C4.5 tree is good at handling continuous variables, that is probably wise because of the gain ratio being used to determine optimal split. The node with the highest gain ratio is chosen as the attribute to split on, and then a child's node is added using that attribute, and then the train function is called recursively on the child. So it'll go through this loop of recursion, and then the algorithm will terminate when the input data all contains the same type of weather event. So the weather event is the predictor attribute, and once after all of the recursion you get to a point where the data being fed in is all the same weather event type, that's when the algorithm is done growing the tree. The second main function in the algorithm for the C4.5 tree is the prediction algorithm. It'll take two inputs, again, First one is one record of data inputs, and the second input is a grown C4.5 tree. So the first step in this function is to see if the first child in the tree is a leaf. And if it's not, then it'll go find the next child in the tree where the feature matches one of the input attributes of the one record of input data. And once it finds a match, the child subtree is passed in recursively to the predict function. And this process continues until a leaf node is reached. Once the leaf node is found, the value of the leaf is returned, and that value will contain the predicted weather event. So rain, fog, thunderstorm, no event, some combination of that. Now, I mentioned that the prediction algorithm only takes one record of data as an input. So the predict function had to be called in a for loop that iterated through all of the records of data in order to get all of the predictions in the data set. Performance metrics that were used for the C4.5 tree, first of all, was a confusion matrix, which is just a plot, well, not a plot, but a matrix of the actual values in your data set versus what the predicted values were. So since our predictor value attribute was weather events, your actual values of weather events would be on one axis and your predicted values of weather events would be on another. And that way you can visualize how many of them were predicted correctly and how many weren't. The next four measures were accuracy percentage, precision, recall, and F measure. So accuracy takes all of the true positives that were predicted over the total number of predictions that were made. Precision takes the true positives divided by all of the predicted positives for that category. Recall takes true positives divided by all the actual positives for that category, and then the F measure combines precision and recall. For each of these four measures, the closer that the number is to 1 implies the higher accuracy or the better performance that the tree has. So given all of that, the two main algorithms and then some small helper functions in the performance metrics, that was all implemented on the data set weather from Austin, Texas. So the tree was trained on the entire data set, and then predictions were ran on the training, validation, and test sets. There were 3 iterations of this training and predicting. So that means 3 trees were grown. First tree, I used all of the attributes in the data set, so all 21. Second tree, I removed redundant attributes. So if you recall, when we were looking at the plot of correlations between all of the variables, and I mentioned there were some that were fairly highly correlated. Those redundant variables were the ones that I removed for the second iteration. And then for the third tree, I only used attributes that had the word average in the name. So when I was describing the data set earlier, I mentioned that, for example, temperature would have a high, a low, and an average. For temperature specifically, I would only keep the average temperature for that day. And that applies for all of the different attribute categories in the data set for tree 3. And then finally, in each iteration, the performance metrics were calculated. Results. So there's a small bug in the handling of continuous variables for the tree. Because of that, that's pretty much why I had to train the tree on the entire data set, and because I was trained on the whole data set, caused accuracy to be 100% for each iteration. So these 3 confusion matrices kind of demonstrate that. These three confusion matrices are shown. They reflect the training data set when I passed it through the prediction function. So the top left matrix is for tree 1, the center one is for tree 2, and the bottom right is for tree 3. And as you can see, all three confusion matrices are identical because they were all spot on in their predicting. Conclusions and future work. So the algorithms successfully built a C4.5 tree and predicted results on a dataset. Future work would be to tweak the training algorithm to better handle continuous variables. That way, when it sees a variable on the continuum that it might not necessarily have seen before, it won't necessarily give an error. And then once that gets tweaked, I would apply the algorithms to other data sets and other geographical locations to see how well they predict results. One thing I think would be really interesting is because Austin, Texas has a specific climate, there's all kinds of climates all over the world. It would be interesting to see how this algorithm trained on Texas data would work using weather for like somewhere in Canada or even somewhere in like South America, just to compare. Okay, so this link will take us to the user dashboard. So as a user interacting with the models to see what the results were and what the data set was like, this is what you would use. Unfortunately, my laptop screen is a little bit small. If you had a desktop, you probably could see it all in one, but we'll just scroll around. So the top half of the dashboard is related specifically to the trees that were built. The bottom half is more descriptive analytics about the data set itself. So we'll start by going over the top half. On the left here is a confusion matrix on the test data, and then on the right are the metrics, F-measure, precision, and recall for the test data as well. As you can see, it's all 1, otherwise it would be some kind of decimal between 0 and 1. Also worth noting right now, you can see the 1 in the confusion matrix, and this says tree 1, so the home screen defaults to tree 1. If you want to see results for tree 2 or tree 3, you can do that, and these two will update. You can see here this says tree 2, and the same for tree 3. So they were all trained on test data, which is why the same amount of points exist in the confusion matrix, but it is the results for 3 different trees. Down here, the timeline shows all of the attributes plotted over time. So you can see the 2013 was the starting range, and then all the way to 2017. On the right hand side here, this matrix, what it's attempting to display is up across the top, you have the different weather events that could take place. So fog, rain, thunderstorm, etc. No event. On the rows here are all the different attributes that exist in the data set. So what it's attempting to show is for any given weather event that takes place, what are the average values of the different attributes in the data set? And it's kind of a lot on the home page, but what is cool about this is you can select a weather event that you're interested in. For example, I will choose rain, and the bottom half of the chart will filter to just show what the weather attributes are for days where rain happened. So the timeline is filtered down, and then if you come over here, it zones in on weather events, on rain-specific weather events, and you can see, what are the average dew point values, humidity, temperature, etc. it kind of makes sense that humidity would be pretty high on days where it's raining. So the user can kind of dig in a little bit deeper to see maybe what kinds of correlations there are between the attributes in the data set and the weather events, and then also get a high-level summary of the iterations of trees that were built. One other functionality I'd like to point out is that you can select an attribute from the color legend here, for example, sea level pressure, and it will highlight the line in both the timeline and also in this matrix, so you can see across all different weather events what are the average values for that attribute. And that is the dashboard, a quick demo of that. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation today.